Out in the raw, untamed territories of the American West, some men were storms powerful and destructive, passing through and leaving ruin in their wake. But one man was a force of nature, a permanent shadow cast over the land. They called him the Grizzly, and for years no one dared stand against him. His rule was absolute, his greed a bottomless pit. But the law of nature has a funny way of finding balance. It doesn't always send a gunslinger or a lawman. Sometimes it sends the most unexpected soul imaginable, a grieving widow with nothing left to lose, who found a reason to fight when she shielded a lost Cherokee boy with her very life. This is that story. The silence of the high plains was a living thing. It had a weight, a texture, a voice that spoke in the rustle of sagebrush and the lonely cry of a red-tailed hawk circling in the vast cerulean sky. For Rachel O'Connell, that silence had once been a comfort, a shared peace with her husband Liam. Now 2 years after the rock slide in the silver mine had claimed him, the silence was a hollow ache, a constant reminder of the empty chair by the hearth and the cold side of the bed. Her homestead was a testament to their shared dream, nestled in a small, fertile valley carved into the foothills of the jagged Colorado Rockies. It was modest, a sturdy log cabin Liam had built with his own hands, a small barn and a corral. Its true treasure, the reason they'd staked their claim here, was the spring. A bubbling artery of pure, cold water that flowed year-round, feeding a creek that nourished their patch of land before meandering down toward the dusty, struggling town of Redemption Gulch. Redemption Gulch was a name born of desperate optimism, a place clinging to life by a thread. It was a single dusty street lined with a handful of weathered buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith and the sheriff's office, which mostly served as a place for Sheriff Brody to nap. The town and the entire surrounding territory lived under a different kind of shadow than the one cast by the mountains. This shadow had a name, Bartholomew Thorne. Thorne wasn't a politician or an outlaw in the traditional sense. He was a cattle baron, a land magnate who had arrived a decade prior with a fortune of unknown origin and an ambition as vast and ruthless as the land itself. He was a bear of a man, with a thick neck, a barrel chest, and a forest of a black beard that was perpetually stained with tobacco juice. His eyes, small and dark, missed nothing and forgave less. It was his physical presence, his booming voice that could curdle milk, and his utter lack of scruple that had earned him the moniker whispered in hushed tones throughout the territory, the Grizzly. Thorne owned the largest ranch, the Lost Horn, which sprawled across tens of thousands of acres. He owned the saloon, held the mortgage on the general store, and had Sheriff Brody so deep in his pocket that the man's tin star seemed to be pinned directly to Thorne's wallet. When the Grizzly wanted something, be it land water rights or a favorable verdict, he got it. Those who resisted found their wells mysteriously going foul, their livestock disappearing, or their barns catching fire in the dead of night. No one ever proved it was Thorne, but everyone knew, and no one dared fight him. Rachel O'Connell knew this better than most. Thorne had wanted her spring from the moment she and Liam had filed their claim. Water was life, and control over it was the ultimate power in this arid land. Thorne had more than enough water for his cattle, but that wasn't the point. He wanted all of it. He'd made them offers starting with what seemed like a generous sum and quickly devolving into veiled threats. Liam, a proud and stubborn Irishman, had told Thorne exactly where he could shove his offers. Rachel often wondered if that defiance had somehow played a part in the mining accident. The foreman had been one of Thorne's men after all, but it was a dark thought, a serpent she kept coiled in the deepest part of her heart, for to unleash it would be to invite a madness she couldn't afford. Her life was now a simple, repeating rhythm of survival. tending her garden, mending clothes, caring for her 2 goats and a handful of chickens. She sold excess vegetables and eggs to Mr. Henderson at the general store, earning just enough for flour, salt, and coffee. She was a ghost in her own life, a woman defined by what she had lost. That rhythm was shattered on a sweltering afternoon in late August. The sun was a merciless hammer beating down on the parched earth. Rachel was by the spring refilling her water bucket. The coldness of the stones, a brief respite from the heat. That's when she saw him. A boy no older than 10 lay collapsed at the edge of the creek, half in and half out of the water. Her heart leaped into her throat. He was Native American, his skin the color of rich copper, his straight black hair matted with dirt and blood. He wore only a torn pair of buckskin leggings. A deep gash ran along his temple, and his small body was covered in scratches and bruises. He was perilously thin, his ribs stark beneath his skin. He was unconscious, but his breathing was shallow and ragged. Rachel didn't hesitate. All the grief, all the loneliness that had hollowed her out was instantly replaced by a fierce primal instinct to protect. She hauled the boy from the water. He weighed next to nothing. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she carried him back to the cabin and laid him gently on Liam's bed. For the next hour she was a whirlwind of purpose. She cleaned the gash on his head, her touch gentle. It was deep but not fractured, she prayed. She washed the grime from his body, revealing a constellation of injuries that spoke of a desperate flight through unforgiving terrain. He had a fever, his skin radiating a dry heat. She trickled water between his cracked lips with a spoon, and he swallowed instinctively. As dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, the boy's eyes fluttered open. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a terror so profound it made Rachel's own sorrow feel small. He tried to scramble away, a wounded animal cornered, but he was too weak. Shh, shh. Rachel soothed, keeping her distance, her hands held up to show she meant no harm. It's all right. You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you. The boy didn't seem to understand her words, but he understood the tone. He watched her, his gaze wary and sharp, his small chest rising and falling in quick, frightened breaths. He was Cherokee. She could tell from the faint patterns on what remained of his leggings. The Cherokee had been pushed from these lands years ago, driven south on the Trail of Tears. To see a lone child this far north was not just unusual, it was dangerous. Someone would be looking for him, and they likely wouldn't be friendly. She knew she needed a doctor. The gash on his head was worrying her, and the fever was climbing. But going into Redemption Gulch meant questions. Sheriff Brody would be notified. And any unusual news in the gulch traveled to the ears of Bartholomew Thorne as surely as the creek flowed downhill. Still, she had no choice. The boy's life was at stake. Leaving him with a bowl of broth he was still too scared to touch, she saddled her old mare Bessie and rode for town as the first stars pricked the indigo sky. She bypassed the sheriff's office and went straight to the small shanty that served as both home and office for Doc Miller. Doc Miller was a kind man in his late 60s with a shock of white hair and hands stained with a lifetime of remedies. He was one of the few people in town who wasn't owned by Thorne, mostly because he was too poor and too stubborn to be bought. He listened to Rachel's hurried, whispered story on his porch, his brow furrowed with concern. "A Cherokee boy, you say, alone," he murmured, stroking his chin. "That's a hornet's nest, Rachel, a real hornet's nest." "I know," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "But he's just a child, and he's hurt badly. I couldn't leave him." The doctor looked at her, his eyes full of a sad understanding. He saw the fire in her that she thought had been extinguished with Liam. "No," he said softly. No, I suppose you couldn't. He gathered his worn leather bag. Thorne's men were in town today. Cole and Pike, asking questions, said they were tracking a stray from a reservation herd, but they looked more like they were tracking a man. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. They were headed up your way when they left. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over Rachel. Cole and Pike were Thorne's chief enforcers, a pair of cruel, witless thugs who enjoyed their work far too much. If they were looking for someone. "We have to hurry, Doc," she said, her voice barely a whisper. They rode back under the light of a slivered moon, a sense of foreboding hanging heavy in the air. The world was quiet again, but this time the silence was not empty. It was listening, and somewhere in the darkness that surrounded her small, defiant circle of light, Rachel knew that the Grizzly was stirring. She had taken something in, something he was hunting, and by doing so, she had just placed her little homestead and her own life squarely in the path of the storm. Doc Miller worked by the flickering lamplight, his movements practiced and efficient. The boy who Rachel had decided to call Tyan in her mind, a Cherokee name she'd once read, meant hawk. For his sharp, watchful eyes remained silent, his gaze darting from the doctor's gentle hands to Rachel's reassuring face. He flinched when the doctor stitched the wound on his temple, but made no sound, a stoicism that was heartbreaking in one so young. "The fever's high, but the wound is clean now," Doc Miller said, packing his bag. "Keep him hydrated. Broth, water, whatever he'll take. The worst of it is the exhaustion and the fear." He looked around the small, immaculate cabin. "You're taking a mighty big risk, Rachel. Thorne's men, they're just bullies," Doc Rachel said, with more conviction than she felt. "They're his bullies," he corrected gently. "And he's been looking for an excuse to get his hands on this spring for years. Don't give him one." After the doctor left, a fragile quiet settled over the cabin. Rachel sat in a rocking chair by the hearth, watching Tyan sleep. The firelight danced across his face, softening the harsh lines of fear and pain. In his slumber, he looked like any other child. Who was he? Where was his family? How did he end up alone and bleeding by her creek? The questions churned in her mind, mixing with the ever-present grief for Liam. Looking at the boy in her husband's bed, she felt a strange and powerful confluence of past and present. She was protecting this child with the same ferocity she had once reserved for her love for Liam. The cabin, for the first time in 2 years, didn't feel empty. It felt purposeful. The next 2 days were a delicate dance of building trust. Tyan's fever broke, and with it some of his terror. He still wouldn't speak, but he began to communicate. He would use his hands, his expressive eyes conveying more than words ever could. He watched Rachel with an unnerving intensity, as if memorizing her every move. He saw the way she touched the brim of Liam's worn hat, which hung on a peg by the door, her fingers tracing the faded band. He saw the sadness that flickered in her eyes when she looked at the empty chair. On the 3rd morning, the inevitable arrived. 2 riders crested the ridge overlooking her valley. Even from a distance, she recognized them. Cole was tall and lanky, a permanently sour expression on his face. Pike was short, stout, and brutal. They rode with the lazy arrogance of men who knew they were feared. Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced back at the cabin where Tyan was watching from the window, his small face pale. "Get in the root cellar," she mouthed to him, pointing to the trap door hidden under a bear skin rug. "Don't come out, no matter what you hear." He understood immediately. A flash of the old terror returned to his eyes, but he nodded and disappeared from the window. Rachel took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and walked out onto the porch, positioning herself in front of the door. She stood there, a lone woman in a faded calico dress, waiting for the wolves. "Mornin', Mrs. O'Connell." Cole said, his voice a lazy drawl as they reined in their horses, deliberately trampling a patch of her marigolds. Pike just grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. "What do you want?" Rachel's voice was steady, betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. "Mr. Thorne sent us." Just checking on his neighbors, Cole said, his eyes scanning the homestead, lingering on the barn, the corral, the cabin. "Heard you had a visitor t'other night." "The doc. I had a touch of fever." Rachel lied smoothly. It passed. That's so Pike chimed in, his voice a gravelly rumble. "We're looking for something. A stray, small thing. Might have wandered onto your land." "The only strays I see are the two of you," Rachel retorted, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Cole's eyes narrowed. "You've got an awful mouthy since your husband ain't around to protect you, Mum." The threat was as sharp as a blade. "We're looking for an Injun boy." "Seen him, I haven't seen anyone," Rachel said, her gaze unwavering. "This is my property, staked and filed according to the law. Unless you have a warrant from a U.S. Marshal, I'll thank you to leave." She mentioned the marshals deliberately. It was a bluff. The nearest federal law was in Denver, days away, but it was the only authority higher than Thorne. Pike chuckled, a nasty, guttural sound. "Ain't no marshals out here, missy. There's just Mr. Thorne." Cole held up a hand, silencing him. He stared at Rachel for a long, unnerving moment, his gaze like a physical weight. "If you're hiding him," he said, his voice low and cold, "Thorne will find out. And when he does, he'll burn this place to the ground with you inside it. He wants this water, Mrs. O'Connell, and now he wants the boy. Don't you be the fool that stands between a grizzly and his meal." They turned their horses and rode away, leaving the scent of menace hanging in the air. Rachel stood rooted to the spot until they were out of sight. Then her knees went weak, and she had to grip the porch railing for support. She had won the skirmish, but the threat of war now loomed over her. When she let Tyann out of the cellar, he looked at her with a new expression in his eyes. It wasn't just trust, it was a kind of shared defiance. He had heard everything. That evening, the dam of his silence finally broke. They were sitting by the fire, the tension of the day still clinging to the cabin's small space. Tyann reached out and touched a small leather pouch that hung around his neck, which Rachel had noticed before, but hadn't disturbed. He pulled it over his head and held it out to her. His voice, when it came, was soft, raspy from disuse, and laced with a Cherokee accent. "Nihai," he said the word for you. He pushed the pouch into her hand. "Safe." Rachel's fingers trembled as she opened the drawstring. Inside were not the simple trinkets of a child she had expected. There was a carved wooden bird, a smooth river stone, and something else wrapped in a piece of doeskin. Carefully she unwrapped it. It was a document. Old parchment, folded many times, the creases worn thin. It was written in elegant script, the ink faded, but still legible. At the top it read, "Treaty of Cession and Land Grant, by order of the United States Territorial Governor." Her eyes scanned the text. It described a parcel of land marked by geographical features, a twin-peaked mountain, a river, bend a series of canyons. It granted this land in perpetuity to a specific band of the Cherokee people as compensation for lands seized further east. The treaty was signed by the territorial governor, a U.S. Army colonel, and marked with the thumbprints and symbols of several Cherokee elders. It was dated 1858. Rachel's blood ran cold. The landmarks it described, the twin peaks to the north, the river. She was living on a corner of this land. Thorne's entire Lost Horn Ranch was carved out of its heart. This document was a legitimate legal claim to the very land Thorne had built his empire upon. Tyann pointed to the parchment. then to the ground, then swept his arm in a wide arc. "Elohai," he whispered, "our land." He then pointed to himself. Ewina, my father's father, grandfather. His ancestors were the signatories. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Thorn wasn't just hunting a stray boy. He was hunting the heir to this claim. He was hunting the proof that his entire kingdom was built on stolen land. Tyan's family, his entire band, were they all gone? Tyan's small hand touched her arm, drawing her attention. He pointed to one of the signatures at the bottom of the document, under the heading Witnesses. The signature was clear, a familiar, strong script she would recognize anywhere. Liam O'Connell. Rachel's world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from her lungs. It couldn't be. Liam, her Liam, a simple miner, a homesteader. He had been a witness to this treaty. No, the date was 1858. Liam wouldn't have been much more than a boy himself, then still in Ireland. It had to be another O'Connell, a relative. Then she saw the second signature beside his. Cormac O'Connell, Liam's father. Liam had never spoken of his father being out west this early. He'd always said they came over together after the Great Famine. It was a lie. His family had been here, and they had known about this treaty. Liam had known. She looked at the date Liam had filed their claim on this specific patch of land. A year before the mine disaster. He hadn't chosen this spot for the water alone. He had chosen it because he knew. He knew it was protected land, Cherokee land, and he was staking a claim on its edge, perhaps as a guardian. He had never told her. Why to protect her? And the rock slide, the foreman who was one of Thorn's men, the convenient accident that silenced the one man who likely knew where to find the descendants of the treaty's signatories, or perhaps even a copy of the document itself. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. The serpent of suspicion she had kept coiled in her heart for 2 years, uncoiled with venomous speed, striking her with the truth. Bartholomew Thorn hadn't just threatened her husband. He had killed him. Rachel looked from the signature on the treaty to the sleeping face of the boy in her husband's bed. This wasn't about charity anymore. This wasn't just about protecting a helpless child from a bully. This was about justice. This was about vengeance. The grieving widow was gone. In her place sat a woman of cold, hard fury. The Grizzly had taken her husband, and now he was trying to kill this boy, to bury the secret forever. No one had ever dared to fight the Grizzly, but no one else had Liam's blood on their hands. She looked at the old Winchester rifle, mounted over the hearth, Liam's rifle. Her hands, no longer trembling, were steady as stone. "He won't get you, Tyan," she whispered into the quiet of the cabin, making a solemn vow to the boy, to Liam, to herself. "He'll have to come through me." The revelation settled not as a weight, but as a core of glacial ice in Rachel's soul. Grief for a time was burned away by the white-hot flame of rage. Every memory of Liam was now cast in a new tragic light. His quiet stares toward the vast expanse of Thorn's ranch, his unexplained melancholy, his fierce insistence on this particular plot of land. He had been carrying a secret, a burden of knowledge that had ultimately cost him his life. And he had left her to face the consequences ignorant. Her first instinct was to ride into redemption. Gulch burst into the sheriff's office and slap the treaty down on his desk. She would expose Thorn for the murderer and thief he was. But the fire of her rage was tempered by a cold, practical dread. Sheriff Brody was a reed in the wind, and Thorn was the hurricane. Brody would likely confiscate the treaty for safekeeping, and it would disappear just as Tyan's family had, just as Liam had. No, the law in Redemption Gulch was a broken tool. She was on her own. For the first time, Rachel truly understood the moniker, Grizzly. A grizzly bear doesn't just chase you, it hunts you. It is relentless territorial and will maul anything that threatens it or its claim. Thorn had tried intimidation with Cole and Pike. It had failed. Now he would move to destruction. She had to be ready. Her homestead became her fortress. Her grief became her fuel. The first change was the most profound. She began to talk to Tyann, truly talk. She told him about Liam, about his laugh that sounded like rolling thunder, about the way he could make anything grow. And Tyann, in his simple, halting English, told her about his people. They hadn't been a large band, just a few families living quietly in the hidden canyons, clinging to the promise of the treaty. They were the keepers of the story. Then Thorn's men had come. They hadn't come with guns blazing, but with a quiet, insidious campaign of attrition. They'd poisoned their water source downstream from Rachel's spring, driven away the game. Starvation was a slower, quieter killer than a bullet. Tyann's father had sent him away with the treaty, the last hope of his people, telling him to find help, to find a man of the law who could not be bought. He had been fleeing for weeks. Their shared stories of loss forged a bond stronger than blood. They were no longer a widow and an orphan. They were survivors, a clan of two against the world. Rachel's days took on a new, grim purpose. She took down Liam's Winchester Model 1873 from above the mantel. The steel was cool and heavy in her hands. She remembered Liam teaching her to shoot, patiently, explaining the mechanisms, the heft, the kick. It had been a pastime, then a novelty. Now it was a necessity. Every morning, she and Tyann would walk to the far end of her small valley. She'd set up old tins on a fence post and practice. At first her shots were wild, the recoil jarring her shoulder. But with each pull of the trigger, her resolve hardened. Her aim grew steady. She wasn't a natural gunslinger, but she was patient and methodical. She learned to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. Tyann, a silent observer, would help her reload his small fingers, surprisingly nimble. He was a quick study, his hawk-like eyes missing nothing. They fortified the cabin. They barred the windows with thick planks that could be lowered at a moment's notice. They dug the root cellar deeper, creating a small, defensible hiding place. Rachel stacked firewood against the northern wall of the cabin, the side facing the ridge from which Thorn's men would most likely approach. It looked like a simple woodpile, but it was thick enough to stop a rifle round. She took inventory of her resources: flour beans, salted pork. Enough for weeks if they were careful. The spring was their lifeline, an indefensible position out in the open, but one they couldn't survive without. Each trip to the spring became a tactical operation, with one of them standing watch while the other filled the buckets. One afternoon, she rode into town not for supplies, but for information. She tied Bessie outside the general store and went in. Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose fear made her sharp-tongued, gave her a wide berth. The chill in the air was palpable. News of her confrontation with Cole and Pike had clearly spread. She was marked. She bought a small bag of coffee beans, her hand steady as she paid. Then, steeling herself, she went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was slumped at his desk, a bottle of cheap whiskey beside him. He looked up as she entered his eyes, bloodshot and weary. "Rachel?" He sighed, running a hand over his face. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't even be in town." "I need to send a telegram, Sheriff," she said, her voice hard. "To the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver." Brody flinched as if she'd struck him. "Don't you do that. Rachel, for the love of God, don't. The telegraph operator, he's one of Thorn's men. The message will get to Thorn before it gets halfway to the mountains. You'll be signing your own death warrant." "So you're telling me there is no law here?" she stated, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. Brodie looked down at his hands. He was not a bad man, merely a weak one, and he hated himself for it. Thorn. He knows about the boy, Rachel. He knows you have him. Pike and Cole are riling up the folks in the saloon, spreading stories, talking about a savage hiding out with the crazy widow O'Connell, saying the boy's people were thieves and murderers. They're poisoning the well, making it so when they make their move, no one in this town will lift a finger to help you. And you'll do nothing, she asked, a sliver of contempt in her voice. What can I do? He pleaded, his voice cracking. I'm one man with a tin star. He's got a dozen guns on his payroll. He owns this town. I have a wife, Rachel. A daughter. Rachel looked at him, at this broken man who represented everything she and Liam had once believed in, order justice a fair chance. And she felt not anger, but a profound pity. He was a prisoner, same as her, just in a different kind of cell. I see, she said quietly. Then God help us all. She walked out, leaving him to his whiskey and his shame. The walk back to her horse was the longest of her life. The townspeople she passed averted their eyes. They were scared. They had families. She understood. But understanding didn't make the loneliness any less crushing. As she was untying Bessie's reins, a hand touched her elbow. She spun around her body, tensing to see Doc Miller standing there. He pressed a small, heavy package wrapped in canvas into her hand. Don't open it till you get home, he whispered, his eyes darting nervously up and down the street. Came on the supply wagon this morning. I ordered it for a patient with a pest problem. He gave her a meaningful look. You've got more fight in you than this whole damn town combined, Rachel O'Connell. Don't let them grind it out of you. He turned and walked away before she could reply. Back in the safety of her valley with Tyan watching, Rachel unwrapped the package. Inside was a brand new Colt Peacemaker revolver, its barrel gleaming with factory oil, and 2 boxes of .45 caliber cartridges. It was a weapon of last resort, a close-quarters gun, a statement. Tears welled in her eyes. It was the first act of true solidarity she'd received. One man in all of Redemption Gulch had dared to help. It was enough. She held the heavy revolver, feeling its grim promise. The Grizzly was coming. He was turning the town against her, building his justification, preparing for the kill. He thought she was a frightened sheep, isolated and ready for the slaughter. He had no idea he had created his own executioner. Over the next few days, an eerie quiet fell. The sky seemed to hold its breath. Even the hawk that usually circled overhead was gone. It was the calm before the storm, and Rachel and Tyan used every moment. They practiced a silent language of signals. They mapped out lines of sight from the cabin windows. They reinforced the barn door. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Tyan did something that moved Rachel more than the doctor's gift. He took the small carved wooden bird from his pouch and gave it to her. For you, he said. For fight. Then he took her to the spring. He knelt by the water and with a sharp stone began to carve into the large flat rock at the water's edge. He carved the symbol of his clan, a stylized hawk. Next to it he carefully etched the shape of a strong, blooming flower. Hawk, he said, pointing to the first symbol. Then he pointed to the flower. You. He looked at her, his dark eyes solemn. Here. Always. He was marking their history, their stand. He was telling her that no matter what happened, this place, this moment would be remembered. Their story was now written in stone. Rachel touched the carving, her fingers tracing the lines. She was no longer just Rachel O'Connell, the widow. She was the flower, the protector. She was the shield. And as darkness fell, she looked towards the ridge, her hand resting on the Colt tucked into her waistband. and she waited. The time for hiding was over. The time for fighting was here. The storm broke on a Sunday. There was a predatory stillness to the morning, a silence that felt heavier and more profound than the usual quiet of the valley. The sun climbed a searing, cloudless sky, beating down with a physical weight, baking the very air until it shimmered above the parched earth. From the town of Redemption, Gulch no church bell rang. The only sermon to be delivered that day would be one of fire, and lead its ministry conducted by men who worshipped only power. Rachel felt their approach before she saw them, a subtle vibration in the ground, a disturbance in the fabric of the morning. She stood on her porch, a tin cup of coffee grown cold in her hand, her eyes fixed on the northern ridge. Then they appeared, a dark, menacing line of riders, etched against the brilliant backdrop of the sun. They were not a posse. They were an army. Her heart, a cold, hard stone in her chest, counted them. Not 2, not 4. There were 10 of them, moving with the fluid, deadly confidence of a wolf pack. At their head, on a magnificent black stallion that seemed carved from midnight and muscle, sat a figure whose sheer bulk blotted out the sun. Bartholomew Thorne had come himself. The Grizzly had emerged from his lair to personally supervise the kill. A tremor of pure primal fear shot through her, a jolt of ice and lightning. It was one thing to defy his thugs, another entirely to face the monster of the territory himself. But then the image of Liam's kind face, smiling as he hammered the last peg into their cabin wall, flashed through her mind. It was followed by the memory of Tyan's solemn eyes as he gifted her the carved bird. The fear did not vanish, but it was caged, transformed into a fuel for the cold, unbending resolve that had taken its place. "He is here," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the finality of a death sentence. She turned and walked back inside the cabin, her movements deliberate, wasting no motion. Tyan was already at her side, his young face a mask of grim determination that mirrored her own. In his hand, he gripped a small hatchet, its blade sharpened to a razor's edge. His knuckles were white. "I fight with you," Tyan stated, his voice low and fierce. It was not a plea. It was a declaration. Rachel stopped and knelt, taking his small shoulders in her hands. Her grip was firm, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said, her voice infused with an iron authority he could not defy. "Your fight is much longer and more important than this one. Your fight is to live, to take that treaty and find the men of law who cannot be bought. You carry the story of your people, Tyan. You are their future. I am just the shield that protects it." Do you understand? Tears welled in the boy's dark eyes, warring with the warrior's spirit within him. He understood her meaning perfectly. His survival was the true victory. He gave a single sharp nod. "Go to the cellar," she commanded gently, "and bar it from the inside. Do not make a sound, and do not open it. Not for anything you hear. Not until I come and knock 3 times. Only then. I promise you, Tyan. I will knock 3 times. He threw his arms around her neck in a quick, fierce hug that spoke volumes of fear, trust, and a shared, desperate love. Then, without another word, he slipped through the trapdoor. Rachel pulled the heavy bearskin rug over it and heard the solid, reassuring thump of the wooden bolt sliding into place below. Now she was truly alone. She moved through the cabin with the grace of a dancer, preparing for a final fatal performance. She lowered the thick wooden bars over the windows, plunging the room into a dim, striped twilight. The narrow slits left behind turned the vast, sun-drenched valley into fragmented, manageable pictures. She laid Liam's Winchester on the table, its long barrel gleaming. She placed the cult peacemaker Doc Miller's gift on the windowsill by the front door, a sentinel waiting for close quarters blasphemy. She checked the loads in both her fingers, moving with a practiced efficiency. Then, breathing slowly, she stood in the center of the room and waited. Outside, the riders fanned out their movements, a practiced encircling dread. They created a loose cordon, a noose tightening around her small patch of life. Thorn rode forward alone, reining in his massive stallion, a mere 20 yards from her porch. He sat his horse like a conquering king, his shadow falling long and dark over the cabin door. Rachel O'Connell. His voice was a physical force, a boom that seemed to shake the very logs of the cabin. It was the voice of absolute arrogance, the roar of a predator that has cornered its prey. You have made a grave error in judgment. You are harboring a savage, and you are squatting on land that belongs to me. The time for games is over. Send the boy out now with the papers he carries. Sign over the deed to this pathetic scrap of dirt, and I will be merciful. I will let you walk away with your life. Peering through the narrow slit beside the door, Rachel felt a cold smile touch her lips. The fool. He thought this was still about land. He thought she could be bought with the promise of her own life. Her voice, when she answered, was not a shout. It was clear, cutting, and carried on the still air with the chilling precision of a thrown knife. This land was never yours, Thorn. It belongs to the Cherokee people, to the boy you call a savage. And you know it. A flicker of surprise, then pure, unrestrained fury crossed Thorn's bloated face. The pretense was shattered. He had been so sure of her ignorance. So the whelp has a tongue after all. It makes no difference. That paper is a ghost story, and ghosts can't stop bullets. You've chosen your side, you foolish woman. I have. Rachel's voice rang out each word, a hammer blow of accusation. I stand with the boy, and I stand for my husband, the one you murdered in your cowardice. You are a thief, Thorn, but you are a murderer first. The public accusation, the one she had held in her heart for so long, hung in the air, electric and undeniable. For a moment, even Thorn was silenced, his face contorting into a thunderous mask of rage. He had profoundly, fatally underestimated this woman. This was not a negotiation. It was a reckoning. Liam O'Connell was a fool who dug his own grave by sticking his nose where it didn't belong. Thorn roared, recovering his voice. A lesson you are about to learn yourself. Coal pike, burn the whole damned place to the ground. Leave nothing but ash. The world exploded into motion and noise. Two of his men, brandishing torches they'd lit from a lantern, broke from the line and made a mad dash for the barn, their faces lit with cruel glee. Rachel was already moving. The Winchester felt like an extension of her arm. She rested its barrel on the window-sill, the wood cool against the hot steel. She exhaled slowly, calming the frantic beat of her heart, just as Liam had taught her. She saw the lead runner, his face a caricature of hate. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack was sharp and authoritative, a clean sound that echoed off the mountainsides. The man screamed a high, piercing sound and dropped his torch as he crumpled to the ground, his leg shattering below the knee. The second man skidded to a halt, his bravado vanishing in a flash of terror, and scrambled back to the relative safety of the rocks, dragging his wounded companion with him. It was the first shot, her declaration of war. An instant later, the valley erupted in a deafening, rolling thunder of gunfire. Bullets rained down on the cabin from all sides, a hail of lead that thudded into the thick log walls like angry fists. Splinters of wood flew through the dim interior. Rachel dropped to the floor, the world a terrifying cacophony. She began to crawl, a desperate snaking movement, from one window slit to another, never giving them a stationary target. This was her home. She knew its angles, its strengths. She fired sparingly, methodically. Each shot was a carefully considered message. A round that kicked up dust in front of a hiding gunman, a bullet that splintered the rock inches from another's head. She wasn't trying to kill them all, not yet. She was trying to break their will, to make them understand that this ground would be paid for in blood and pain. The heavy woodpile she and Tyann had stacked against the northern wall absorbed a full volley of shots, the lead slugs burying themselves harmlessly in the dense logs. Through a slit she saw Cole, the lanky thug, trying a wide flanking maneuver, sneaking toward the spring, where he could get a clear angle on the less protected back of the cabin. She tracked his progress, waited for him to break cover between two boulders, and fired. The bullet tore a furrow in the earth at his feet, sending him diving for cover with a curse. The battle raged, a compressed eternity of noise, fear, and adrenaline. The air in the cabin grew thick and hazy with the acrid metallic stench of gunpowder. Her shoulder screamed in protest from the Winchester's repeated recoil. But beneath the pain, her resolve was a diamond, hard and unbreakable. Thorne, watching from a safe distance, was apoplectic. His face was purple with rage. 10 of his best men held at bay by a single stubborn woman. "The porch!" He bellowed, his voice raw with fury. "Are you all cowards? Get on the damn porch and break that door down!" Spurred by his rage, Pike, the brutish one, and another man grabbed a heavy fallen log and charged the cabin, using it as a makeshift battering ram. The heavy thud of the log against the door reverberated through Rachel's bones. She abandoned the Winchester and snatched the Colt Peacemaker from the windowsill. This was the doctor's grim gift. The time for it had come. She flattened herself against the interior wall beside the door, listening to the splintering wood, her heart hammering in time with the blows. Thud! Thud! On the third impact, the door jamb shattered, and the door flew inward with a groan of tortured wood. Pike, roaring in triumph, charged through the opening, a hulking silhouette against the blinding sun. He never saw her. Rachel pivoted and fired the Colt from her hip. The revolver's roar inside the confined space was cataclysmic, a physical blow of sound and force. Pike grunted, as if punched, a look of pure, dumbfounded astonishment on his face. He staggered backward out of the doorway, his hand clamped to a gushing wound in his shoulder, and collapsed onto the porch. But that single vital second of focus on the door was the opening her enemies needed. Through the window she saw Cole. He had used the distraction of the battering ram to perfection. He had his angle. But he wasn't aiming at her. His gaze was fixed downward, his rifle leveled at the bearskin rug, at the floorboards, at the cellar where he knew the boy was hiding. A vicious, triumphant grin split his face. Time fractured. Rachel saw everything with a horrifying, crystalline clarity. The glint of the sun on Cole's rifle, the calculated coldness in his eyes, the absolute certainty of what was about to happen. There was no time to aim, no time to shoot. There was only one possible move. With a cry that was torn from the very depths of her soul, she launched herself across the room. She was not a woman. She was pure instinct, a mother protecting her young. She threw her body over the trap-door, a living shield of flesh and bone, an instant before Cole's rifle cracked. The world dissolved into an explosion of pure, white-hot agony. The bullet tore through her left shoulder, a searing, ripping violation that stole her breath and her strength. The impact threw her sideways, her head cracking hard against the leg of the heavy oak table. The world became a nauseating vortex of blackness and light. From far away, as if at the bottom of a well, she could hear Tyann screaming her name from beneath the floorboards. She had done it. She had shielded him. Through a swimming grey haze, she saw Cole's triumphant face reappear in the window. He was already taking aim for the second shot, the one that would finish her. This is it. She thought, a strange sense of calm washing over her. Liam, I'm coming to you. Suddenly another shot rang out, sharp and distinct from the others. It wasn't from Cole's rifle. It came from the road leading from town. Cole yelped in pain and surprise, his rifle clattering to the ground as he clutched his arm and vanished from the window. Fighting against the encroaching darkness, Rachel pushed herself up. Her vision was a blurry, red-tinged tunnel. Her entire left side was numb, and yet on fire, and her dress was soaked with a terrifying warmth. She dragged herself to the open doorway and peered out. It was an impossible sight. Riding hard up the trail, their horses, kicking up plumes of dust, were two figures. One was Doc Miller, his white hair flying, brandishing an ancient-looking shotgun like a holy relic. The other, impossibly, was Sheriff Brody. His face was ashen, his knuckles white on the stock of a rifle, but his eyes, for the first time since she'd known him, blazed with a desperate, righteous fire. Hearing the sustained gunfire, knowing he had sent a good woman to her death, Brody's shame had finally outweighed his fear. He had found the one other man in town with a spine, and they had come. It was a suicidal gesture, 2 men against Thorne's remaining gang, but it was a stand, and it was enough. Their arrival was the spark that ignited a panic. Thorne's men were hired guns bullies accustomed to terrorizing the unarmed. They had signed on to burn out a lone widow, not to fight a pitched battle against armed and determined men. Seeing their leaders' enforcers, Cole and Pike, both wounded, and seeing the law, however feeble, finally arrive, their fragile loyalty evaporated. 2 of them spurred their horses and fled back toward the ridge. Then 2 more. Thorne, seeing his army deserting him, roared in a paroxysm of frustration. "Cowards, traitors! I'm paying you to fight!" He fired his own massive revolver after the retreating riders, but it was useless. His power, built on fear, was crumbling in minutes. Only he remained. His rage turned back to the source of his humiliation, the woman in the cabin. He had to end this. He had to get that treaty. Spurring his magnificent stallion, he aimed the great beast directly at the open cabin door in a final mad charge, intending to trample her and everything she stood for under his horse's hooves. Inside, Rachel was fading the world a dim, roaring sea. But she saw him coming, the massive, terrifying spectre of the man who had murdered her husband, come to finish the job. A final primal surge of adrenaline coursed through her. She was a shield. A shield does not break. She located the heavy Colt which had fallen beside her. Her left arm was useless, a dead weight, but she gripped the gun with her right hand, using her left to steady it as she pushed herself to her knees. Her vision swam. The charging horse and rider filled her world. He raised his pistol to fire. In that last, eternal second, a choice was made. Vengeance demanded his life. But Liam had been a man of justice, and Tyann deserved a world with justice in it. She shifted her aim. She fired. The bullet struck not the man, but the horse. The noble black stallion screamed a sound of agony and confusion, and its powerful legs buckled. It crashed to the earth in a tangle of limbs, throwing Thorne from the saddle. The big man landed with a sickening crunch, his leg twisting beneath the weight of the falling animal. He lay pinned, his reign of terror ending not in a blaze of glory, but with a pathetic, agonized cry of pain, trapped by his own dying mount. A profound silence descended upon the valley, broken only by Thorne's whimpering and the ragged gasps of Sheriff Brody, who now stood over the fallen tyrant, his rifle aimed squarely at the Grizzly's chest. Rachel let the Colt peacemaker slip from her numb fingers. She saw Doc Miller's panicked face as he ran toward her. She heard Tyann, his voice, frantic, trying to unbolt the cellar door from the inside. She had faced the monster. She had not broken. As the last of her strength gave out, and the world finally went black, her last coherent thought was of the carving on the stone by the spring, the hawk and the flower, the shield had held. And so the reign of the Grizzly ended, not at the hands of a famous lawman, but because of the courage of a widow who refused to let her grief be the end of her story. Bartholomew Thorne was taken to Denver, where the treaty presented by a U.S. Marshal, summoned by Sheriff Brody, sealed his fate. The document not only exposed his land theft, but led to testimony that convicted him of the murder of Liam O'Connell. In redemption, Gulch something shifted. The shadow lifted, and people began to look each other in the eye again. Sheriff Brody, a man reborn, wore his tin star with a new weight and a new pride. And on a small homestead in the foothills, a new family was forged from fire and sacrifice. Rachel O'Connell recovered the scar on her shoulder, a permanent reminder of the price of courage. She and Tyann, the last keeper of his people's story, became the guardians of the land, their lives forever intertwined. This story, drawn from the countless unwritten histories of the West, reminds us that heroes are not always the ones with the fastest gun, but often those with the strongest heart. It shows that even in the face of absolute power, one person standing for what is right can become an unbreakable shield. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and the enduring power of the human spirit moved you, please help us share it. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a great story, and subscribe to our channel for more tales from the annals of history. Your support allows us to keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.